In the misty hollows of Blue Ridge Mountains, where ancient secrets whisper through towering pines and forgotten dreams take root in rocky soil, sometimes the most wounded souls find exactly what they need to heal. Rebecca Mitchell never imagined that fleeing to her grandmother's crumbling cabin would lead her straight into the arms of a man the townspeople called a legend. She was just a broken woman trying to escape the wreckage of her life, carrying scars that ran deeper than the mountain valleys themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Sullivan lived like a ghost among the peaks of Eagle's Peak, a man who turned his back on civilization after it had failed him in the cruelest ways possible. The locals spoke of him in hushed tones, calling him everything from hermit to guardian angel, but none dared venture into his domain. Yet when autumn's first frost painted the mountains gold and Rebecca's world began crumbling around her, she would discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. But could two people who'd given up on love and trust find healing in each other's broken pieces? Or would the forces trying to destroy her mountain sanctuary succeed in tearing apart their fragile chance at redemption? The October morning mist clung to the mountains like a grandmother's embrace, soft and protective, wrapping around the ancient peaks that had watched over Millbrook Valley for centuries. Rebecca Mitchell stood on the sagging front porch of her grandmother's cabin, clutching a steaming mug of coffee in hands that still trembled when she thought too deeply about the reasons that had brought her here. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the accident that had shattered her world into pieces so small she wasn't sure they could ever be reassembled. 6 months since the drunk driver had taken David away from her on what should have been their second wedding anniversary. 6 months since she'd learned that grief could be a living thing that followed you everywhere, whispering reminders of all the dreams that would never come true. The cabin creaked behind her, a symphony of settling wood and memories that stretched back 3 generations. Grandmother Rose had left it to her, in a will that Rebecca had barely read before stuffing it into a drawer, too overwhelmed by loss to think about mountain retreats and family legacies. But when the sympathy cards stopped coming and the casseroles from well-meaning neighbors dwindled to nothing, when the empty house in Richmond became too quiet to bear, she'd remembered this place. Now, standing here with morning light filtering through trees that had been saplings when her great-grandfather first cleared this land, Rebecca wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The cabin was worse than she'd expected, its tin roof sporting holes that let in both rain and wildlife, its foundation stones shifted by decades of mountain freezes and thaws. The well hadn't been used in years, and the generator that was supposed to provide electricity made sounds that suggested it was more rust than machine. She'd driven up the winding mountain road 3 days ago with everything she owned crammed into the back of her Honda Civic, fleeing Richmond like a refugee from her own life. The teaching job that had once filled her with purpose felt meaningless after losing David. Standing in front of a classroom full of bright faces, trying to inspire young minds to believe in their futures, when she couldn't even imagine her own tomorrow, it had become impossible. The settlement from David's life insurance policy sat untouched in her bank account, money that felt like blood money because it existed only because he didn't. She'd thought maybe here, in this place where her grandmother had found peace after her own husband's death, she might learn how to breathe again without feeling like she was betraying David's memory by continuing to live. But the cabin seemed determined to test her resolve. Yesterday she'd discovered that the old stone chimney had partially collapsed, filling the main room with debris and making it impossible to use the fireplace that was supposed to be her primary source of heat. This morning she'd woken to find that something had gotten into the pantry overnight, destroying most of her carefully hoarded food supplies and leaving evidence of its visit that would require serious cleaning. The closest neighbor was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who lived 2 miles down the mountain road in a house that looked like it belonged on a Christmas card. Eleanor had stopped by yesterday with a casserole and a warning about the approaching weather, her kind eyes taking in Rebecca's pale complexion and the dark circles that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Winter comes early up here, dear," Eleanor had said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd lived through 73 mountain winters. "And it comes hard. You'll want to make sure you're prepared, especially living alone like you are. These mountains don't forgive folks who aren't ready for what they can dish out." Rebecca had thanked her for the advice and the food, but privately wondered if she was ready for anything anymore. The woman who'd once organized school fundraisers and planned elaborate dinner parties seemed to have disappeared somewhere between the hospital waiting room and the funeral home, leaving behind someone who struggled to manage basic tasks like grocery shopping without breaking down in the cereal aisle. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke through her melancholy thoughts, and she looked up to see a battered pickup truck navigating the rocky driveway with the confidence of someone familiar with challenging terrain. The truck was ancient, probably from the 1980s, its paint faded to a color that might once have been blue but now looked more like the sky during a storm. Behind the wheel sat a woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face weathered by years of mountain living but animated with the kind of energy that some people maintained well into their later years. This had to be Maggie Thompson, the owner of Thompson's Diner in Cedar Falls, whom Eleanor had mentioned as someone worth knowing. Maggie climbed out of the truck with the easy movement of someone accustomed to physical work, her boots hitting the ground with confidence as she surveyed the cabin and its obvious need for attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She wore jeans that had seen better decades and a flannel shirt that looked like it could survive a nuclear winter. But her smile was warm enough to melt the morning frost. "You must be Rose's granddaughter," Maggie said, approaching the porch with her hand extended. "I'm Maggie Thompson. Your grandmother was one of my dearest friends, and I've been meaning to get up here and check on you since Eleanor mentioned you'd arrived." Rebecca accepted the handshake, noting the strength in Maggie's grip and the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "Rebecca Mitchell, thank you for coming. Grandmother always spoke fondly of you in her letters." "Rose was special," Maggie said, her eyes taking on the soft look that people got when remembering someone they'd truly loved. "This place meant the world to her, especially after your grandfather passed. She used to say it was where she learned that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely." The observation hit closer to home than Rebecca was prepared for, and she felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'm beginning to understand what she meant," she said quietly. Maggie's keen eyes didn't miss the pain in Rebecca's voice, but she was wise enough not to push for details. Instead, she gestured toward the cabin with the practical assessment of someone who dealt with mountain properties before. "Eleanor mentioned you might need some help getting this place ready for winter." I can see she wasn't exaggerating. Rebecca followed Maggie's gaze, seeing the cabin through the eyes of someone who understood mountain living. The collapsed chimney, the damaged roof, the windows that didn't quite seal properly. It all added up to a structure that might not survive a harsh winter, let alone keep its inhabitants safe and warm. "I'm not sure where to start," Rebecca admitted, the confession coming easier than she'd expected. "I keep thinking I should be able to handle this myself, but everything seems to need more expertise than I have. Mountain living is a skill you learn, not something you're born knowing," Maggie said kindly. "Even folks who grew up here sometimes need help when they're dealing with a place that's been empty for a while. The good news is that this cabin has good bones. Rose's grandfather built it to last, and with the right attention, it'll outlive all of us." As if summoned by their conversation about the cabin's needs, the morning quiet was broken by the distant sound of a chainsaw echoing from somewhere up the mountain. The sound was rhythmic and purposeful, the work of someone who knew what they were doing with dangerous equipment. Maggie's expression shifted slightly, becoming more thoughtful as she listened to the mechanical symphony filtering down through the trees. "That'll be Jake," she said, and something in her tone suggested layers of meaning that Rebecca didn't yet understand. Jake Sullivan, lives up on Eagles Peak, maybe 3 miles northeast of here as the crow flies. Probably twice that by any trail a normal person could manage." Maggie paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He's what you might call our local mountain man. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a way of showing up when folks need help, whether they know they need it or not." Rebecca found herself curious despite her usual reluctance to engage with new people. "What kind of help?" "Oh, all sorts. Last winter the Hendersons' roof collapsed under the snow, and Jake appeared out of nowhere with lumber and tools, had it patched before they even knew it was fixed. When little Tommy Wilson got lost hiking last spring, Jake found him in 2 hours after the search and rescue team had been looking for a day and a half." Maggie's voice carried the respect that mountain people reserved for those who proved themselves through actions rather than words. "He sounds like quite a character." Rebecca said, though part of her wondered what kind of man chose to live in complete isolation on a mountain peak. He is that, Maggie agreed. Though he wasn't always a hermit. Used to be in the military, I'm told. Special forces or some such thing. But something happened over there, and when he came back, he just couldn't settle into regular life. Been up on that mountain for going on 5 years now. The chainsaw sound had stopped, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper for having been broken. Rebecca found herself looking toward the tree line, wondering about this mysterious mountain man who appeared when people needed help but chose to live apart from human contact. Do you think, she began hesitantly, then stopped, unsure how to voice the question that was forming in her mind. Do I think he might be willing to help you get this place winterized? Maggie finished with the perception of someone who'd spent decades reading people. I think Jake Sullivan has never met a person in genuine need that he didn't try to help, whether they asked for it or not. The question is whether you're ready to accept help from someone who's about as far from civilized society as you can get without actually becoming a bear. Rebecca considered this, weighing her desperate need for practical assistance against her instinctive wariness of complications. Since David's death, she'd retreated from most human contact, finding it easier to manage her grief without having to navigate other people's expectations or discomfort with her pain. The idea of inviting a stranger, especially one with his own obvious issues, into her fragile attempts at healing, seemed both appealing and terrifying. What would I need to do? She asked finally. To ask for his help, I mean. Maggie smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features with genuine warmth. Nothing. Jake doesn't work that way. If he decides you need help, he'll just show up. Though I suspect the fact that you're Rose's granddaughter, living in Rose's cabin, will carry some weight with him. He had a lot of respect for your grandmother. They knew each other. Rose was one of the few people Jake would actually talk to when he first moved up here. She used to leave supplies at the old hunting shelter about halfway up the trail to his place. Never asked for anything in return. Never tried to counsel him, or fix him, or any of the things well-meaning folks usually try to do with damaged people. Just left what he might need, and went on about her business. The image of her grandmother quietly caring for a wounded stranger fit perfectly with Rebecca's memories of Rose Mitchell, a woman who'd believed in showing love through actions rather than words, who'd understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was knowing when not to intrude. She never mentioned him in her letters. Rebecca said, Rose was good at keeping confidences, and Jake's story isn't hers to tell. Maggie glanced at the sun, which was climbing higher into a sky that promised a beautiful autumn day despite the morning's chill. I should let you get on with your day, but I wanted you to know that you're not as alone up here as you might think. Cedar Falls takes care of its own, and you're one of us now, whether you planned it that way or not. The simple declaration brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. For months, she'd felt like she was floating through life without an anchor, unmoored from everything that had once defined her. The idea of belonging somewhere again, even somewhere she'd never planned to stay, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. Maggie reached into her truck and pulled out a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Eleanor mentioned you might be running low on supplies, so I brought a few things from the diner. Nothing fancy, just some bread I baked this morning, and some soup that'll keep well. And there's a thermos of coffee that's actually worth drinking. Unlike whatever you've been making with that ancient percolator I saw in the kitchen window. Rebecca accepted the basket gratefully, touched by the thoughtfulness of people who barely knew her but were willing to extend kindness based on nothing more than her connection to a woman they'd loved. I don't know how to repay this kind of generosity. You don't repay it, you accept it gracefully, and pass it along when you're in a position to help someone else. That's how mountain communities work. Maggie climbed back into her truck, then paused with the window down. And Rebecca? Don't be surprised if you find some firewood stacked by your door one morning, or if that generator starts running better than it has any right to. Like I said, Jake has a way of showing up when folks need help. As Maggie's truck disappeared down the winding driveway, Rebecca stood holding the basket and feeling more connected to this place and these people than she had to anything in months. The cabin still needed enormous amounts of work, winter was still approaching with the inevitability of mountain weather, and she was still a city woman completely out of her element in this rugged landscape. But for the first time since David's death, she felt like she might not be facing her challenges entirely alone. And somewhere up on Eagle's Peak, a chainsaw had resumed its rhythmic work, the sound carrying on the mountain air like a promise that help might come from the most unexpected places. The afternoon brought the kind of Indian summer warmth that made the mountains feel magical, as if the approaching winter was just a distant threat rather than an inevitable reality. Rebecca spent the day exploring her grandmother's property more thoroughly, discovering a hand-dug well that might still be functional, and a root cellar that could provide storage if she could clear out decades of accumulated debris. Every task revealed new problems that required solutions she didn't possess, but also small victories that reminded her she was stronger than she'd given herself credit for. By the time the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away, she felt more grounded than she had in months. It was as she was carrying the last armload of debris from the root cellar that she first saw him. The figure emerged from the tree line like something from a dream or a nightmare, depending on one's perspective. Rebecca froze with her arms full of rotting wood and rusted cans, watching as a man stepped out of the shadows between the towering pines with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He was tall, probably well over 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who lived an active life without the benefit of modern conveniences. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, touching his collar and showing threads of silver that suggested he was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but it couldn't hide the strong jawline or the intense eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single sweeping glance. He wore clothes that looked like they'd been chosen for durability rather than style, canvas pants that had seen better years, a flannel shirt that might once have been green but had faded to the color of forest shadows, and boots that looked like they could walk through anything the mountains could throw at them. Over his shoulder, he carried what appeared to be a canvas pack, and in his hands was an axe that gleamed with the kind of careful maintenance that marked a craftsman's tool. For a moment that seemed to stretch like sunlight across water, they simply looked at each other. Rebecca felt her heart rate increase, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she couldn't have said. There was something almost elemental about him, as if he belonged to these mountains in a way that made her feel like an intruder in her own grandmother's backyard. Then he spoke, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, carrying a warm rumble that seemed to resonate with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to when he chose to speak. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Sullivan. I believe Maggie Thompson might have mentioned me." He stayed where he was, making no move to approach closer, as if he understood that his sudden appearance might be unsettling to a woman alone in an isolated location. "She did," Rebecca managed, setting down her armload of debris with hands that had developed a slight tremor. "I'm Rebecca Mitchell. Rose Mitchell was my grandmother." Something shifted in his expression at the mention of her grandmother's name, a softening that transformed his weathered features from intimidating to something approaching gentle. "Rose was a good woman. She helped me through some difficult times when I first came to these mountains. I'm sorry for your loss." The simple statement, delivered without elaborate sympathy or uncomfortable attempts at consolation, hit Rebecca with unexpected force. Most people seemed to feel compelled to tell her that David was in a better place now, or that everything happened for a reason, or that she needed to move on with her life. Jake's acknowledgement of loss without trying to minimize or explain it away felt like the first honest response she'd received in months. "Thank you," she said quietly. She always spoke of this place like it was magical. "I'm beginning to understand why." Jake nodded toward the cabin, his sharp eyes taking in the obvious signs of neglect and the scope of work that would be required to make it livable through a mountain winter. "Maggie mentioned you might be planning to stay through the cold months. That's ambitious for someone who's not used to mountain living." There was no judgment in his voice, just the practical assessment of someone who understood the realities of surviving in this environment. Rebecca found herself appreciating his directness, so different from the careful tiptoeing around her feelings that most people seem to think was necessary. Ambitious might be too kind a word, she admitted. Desperate might be more accurate. I needed somewhere to go, and this was the only place that felt like it might welcome me. Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from her face to the cabin and back again. When he spoke, there was something in his tone that suggested he understood more about desperation than she might have expected. Mountains have a way of providing what people need, if they're willing to work for it. But they don't forgive folks who aren't prepared for what winter can bring. He gestured toward the cabin with his free hand. Mind if I take a look around? Might be able to give you an idea of what needs doing first. Rebecca hesitated, caught between gratitude for his offer and uncertainty about inviting a stranger to evaluate her situation. Everything she'd heard about Jake Sullivan suggested he was trustworthy, but her instincts had been so damaged by loss that she wasn't sure she could rely on them anymore. As if sensing her internal conflict, Jake set his pack and axe down in a deliberate movement that made it clear he wasn't trying to intimidate or rush her. I understand if you'd rather not. Living alone changes how you think about strangers, and you don't know me from Adam. But your grandmother did me some kindnesses when I was struggling to find my footing here, and I'd like to return the favor if you'll let me. The mention of her grandmother's kindness decided the matter for Rebecca. Rose Mitchell had been an excellent judge of character, and if she'd trusted this man enough to help him when he was struggling, that was recommendation enough. I'd appreciate your advice, she said, meaning it. I have to admit, I'm completely out of my depth here. Everything I know about home maintenance comes from watching YouTube videos, and somehow I don't think that's going to be enough for mountain living. Jake's mouth quirked slightly in what might have been the beginning of a smile. YouTube's got its place, but mountain winters require some old-fashioned know-how. Let's start with the basics and work our way up to the complicated stuff. He moved toward the cabin with the economical gait of someone who never wasted energy on unnecessary movement. Rebecca followed, watching as he examined the foundation stones, the condition of the porch supports, and the way the roof lines sagged in places that suggested structural issues. Foundation's solid, he said after a thorough inspection of the cabin's base. Your great-grandfather knew what he was doing when he laid these stones. They've shifted some over the years, but nothing that can't be corrected. He pointed to several places where gaps had opened between stones. These need to be chinked before cold weather sets in, or you'll have rodents and worse making themselves at home. Rebecca made mental notes, trying to absorb information that felt simultaneously overwhelming and manageable when broken down into specific tasks. Jake moved methodically around the building, explaining problems and potential solutions in language that didn't make her feel stupid for not already knowing what needed to be done. The collapsed chimney drew his particular attention, and he spent several minutes examining the debris and the remaining structure before delivering his verdict. Good news is that most of the chimney is still sound. Bad news is that you can't use the fireplace until this is rebuilt. And that's not a job for someone without experience. Stone work requires specific skills, and a poorly built chimney can kill you with carbon monoxide poisoning. How long would it take to fix? Rebecca asked, already calculating costs she couldn't afford. Depends on how much help you have, and how much of the work you're comfortable doing yourself. The actual rebuilding needs to be done by someone who knows masonry, but the cleanup and preparation work could be handled by anyone willing to get their hands dirty. Jake glanced at her, noting her practical clothes and the way she'd already been tackling the debris removal. You seem like someone who's not afraid of physical work. I'm learning not to be, Rebecca said. Though I have to admit, 6 months ago I would have called a contractor for anything more complicated than changing a light bulb. Circumstances have a way of teaching you what you're capable of. Something flickered in Jake's expression, a recognition that suggested he understood exactly what she meant about circumstances forcing personal growth. Mountains have a way of stripping things down to what really matters. Can be harsh, but it's honest. They continued the inspection, moving from the obvious problems to the more subtle issues that could become serious threats once winter arrived. The windows needed weatherproofing, the roof required patching in several spots, and the electrical system that powered the few lights and outlets was so old it belonged in a museum rather than a functioning home. Generators in rough shape too, Jake observed after examining the ancient machine that was supposed to provide power when the occasional electrical service failed. Probably hasn't been serviced in years. I can get it running reliably, but you're going to want a backup plan for heat and light when it inevitably breaks down during the worst possible weather. Rebecca felt her spirit sinking as the list of necessary repairs grew longer and more expensive. The money from David's life insurance could cover the costs, but spending it felt like another betrayal of his memory, another step toward a future that didn't include him. Jake seemed to sense her growing discouragement, because he stopped his catalog of problems and leaned against the porch railing, studying her face with the kind of perceptive attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. Feeling overwhelmed, he asked gently. Completely, Rebecca admitted. I keep thinking I should be able to handle this myself, but every solution requires skills or resources I don't have. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should go back to Richmond and find an apartment where the biggest maintenance issue is a leaky faucet. Maybe Jake agreed, his tone carefully neutral. But before you decide that, let me ask you something. How did you feel this morning when you woke up here? The question caught her off guard, forcing her to consider something she hadn't really examined. Different, she said slowly. For the first time in months, I didn't wake up thinking about David being gone. I woke up thinking about what needed to be done today. Jake nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd suspected. That's not nothing. Grief has a way of taking over everything until you can't see past it. If this place gives you something else to focus on, something that belongs to you and your family's history, that might be worth fighting for. But the money, the work, the isolation, are all problems that can be solved, Jake interrupted. Question is whether you want to solve them, or whether you'd rather let them solve you. The challenge in his words stung, but not in a way that made her angry. Instead, it reminded her of David's voice during her lowest moments in college, when self-doubt had threatened to derail her education plans. He'd had the same way of cutting through her excuses to the real issue underneath. You think I should stay, she said. I think you should do whatever gives you the best chance of healing from whatever brought you here, Jake replied. But I also think there's something to be said for fighting for a place that calls to you. Your grandmother understood that. She could have sold this place and moved to town years ago. But she chose to stay and deal with the challenges because this was where she belonged. Rebecca looked around at the mountains that surrounded them, noting how the late afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and amber that seemed to make the whole world glow. There was something about this place that felt like home in a way Richmond never had, despite living there for most of her adult life. If I decided to stay, she said carefully. Hypothetically speaking, how would someone go about tackling all these repairs? Assuming they had more determination than money, and more willingness to learn than actual knowledge. Jake's expression shifted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of what might have been approval in his storm-gray eyes. Hypothetically, someone in that situation would want to prioritize projects that affect safety and basic livability. Get the roof watertight, the chimney safe, and the heating situation sorted before the first serious snow. Everything else can wait until spring. And how would this hypothetical person go about finding help with projects they can't handle alone? Well, Jake said slowly, this hypothetical person might find that mountain communities have a tradition of helping newcomers get established, especially when those newcomers are connected to families that have been part of the community for generations. And they might discover that some folks are willing to trade work for other kinds of compensation when cash is tight. What kind of compensation? Jake was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. Someone like me, living alone up on the mountain, doesn't get many home-cooked meals or much in the way of human conversation. Someone who's good company and can manage a decent meal might find that those skills are more valuable than money to the right person. The offer was made so casually that it took Rebecca a moment to understand what he was suggesting. Jake Sullivan, The mysterious mountain man who avoided human contact and lived in complete isolation was offering to help her restore the cabin in exchange for nothing more than meals and companionship. "You do that?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise out of her voice. "Trade skilled labor for food and conversation." "I do that for Rose Mitchell's granddaughter, who's trying to make a life in the place Rose loved most," Jake said simply. "Your grandmother fed me more than once when I was getting established here, and she never made me feel like charity case. I'd like to return that kindness if you'll let me." Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity of someone who barely knew her but was willing to extend trust and help based on nothing more than respect for her grandmother's memory. It was the first time since David's death that someone had offered her something without making her feel pitied or broken. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll think about it," Jake replied. "And say you'll let me know what you decide before the weather turns. Winter comes fast up here, and if we're going to get you ready for it, we need to start soon." He gathered his pack and axe, preparing to disappear back into the forest as suddenly as he'd appeared. But he paused at the edge of the clearing, turning back to look at her with an expression that carried unexpected intensity. "Rebecca," he said, using her name for the first time. "I know what it feels like to think you're too broken for anyone to want to help. I know what it's like to believe that accepting kindness somehow diminishes you or dishonors the people you've lost. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let other people care about you, even when you can't quite care about yourself yet." The words hit her like a physical blow, cutting straight through all her carefully constructed defenses to the raw wound at the center of her being. She stood speechless, watching as Jake Sullivan melted back into the forest with the same ghostly ease with which he'd appeared, leaving her alone with his offer and the growing realization that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face her mountains alone. As the sun set behind the western peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Rebecca sat on her grandmother's porch and tried to imagine what it would be like to rebuild not just a cabin, but a life. For the first time in months, the future seemed like something more than just an endless series of days to be endured. Somewhere up on Eagle's Peak, a light flickered between the trees, barely visible through the gathering darkness. Jake Sullivan was up there, living his own version of exile and healing, and tomorrow she would have to decide whether she was brave enough to accept his help and everything it might mean for both of their carefully guarded hearts. The night air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and in the distance an owl called from somewhere deep in the forest. Rebecca pulled her grandmother's quilt tighter around her shoulders and allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found her way to exactly where she needed to be. The decision came to Rebecca at 3 in the morning, when she woke to the sound of something large moving around outside the cabin. She lay in her grandmother's old bed, listening to what sounded like footsteps on the gravel path that led to the root cellar, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to decide whether to investigate or hide under the covers like a child afraid of monsters. The rational part of her mind cataloged the possibilities. Bears were common in these mountains, as were deer and other wildlife that might be attracted to the scents around a human dwelling. But the newly awakened part of her that had spent months jumping at every unexpected sound whispered darker possibilities, reminding her that she was a woman alone in an isolated location with no cell phone service and the nearest neighbor 2 miles away. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of wood being stacked, rhythmic and purposeful, and she knew with sudden certainty that her mysterious midnight visitor wasn't an animal at all. Someone was outside her cabin in the middle of the night, doing something that sounded distinctly like work. Rebecca slipped out of bed and crept to the window, pulling aside the faded curtains her grandmother had sewn decades ago. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light bright enough to see clearly, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Jake Sullivan stood near the side of the cabin, methodically stacking split firewood in neat rows against the building's foundation. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before, his movements economical and sure despite the darkness. A wheelbarrow sat nearby, nearly empty now, but obviously used to transport the wood from wherever he'd cut and split it. He wore the same clothes she'd seen him in earlier, but now they were dusted with sawdust and bark, evidence of hours of labor that had been performed while she slept. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and she could see the steam rising from his body, indicating he'd been working hard enough to generate significant heat despite the mountain chill. The sight of him there, working in silence to provide something she desperately needed without being asked and without expecting recognition, hit Rebecca with an emotional force that left her momentarily breathless. It was such a simple act, but it carried depths of consideration and kindness that she'd almost forgotten existed in the world. She watched until he finished stacking the last of the wood, then gathered his wheelbarrow and disappeared back into the forest as silently as he'd arrived. Only then did she creep outside to examine what he'd left behind. The wood pile was substantial, enough split hardwood to keep a fire burning for weeks if she used it carefully. Each piece was cut to the perfect size for her grandmother's old wood stove, and the wood itself was seasoned oak and maple that would burn hot and clean. At the base of the pile, wrapped in oiled canvas to protect it from moisture, she found kindling and fat wood that would make starting fires simple even for someone with limited experience. Tucked under one corner of the canvas was a folded piece of paper, and Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she opened it to read the message written in Jake's careful handwriting. "Rebecca, this should get you started while you think about my offer. The wood stove in the kitchen is in good working order, and this wood will burn clean and hot. Stack a day's worth inside each evening so it has time to come to room temperature before you burn it. If you decide you want help with the bigger projects, leave a lantern in the front window after sunset. If not, I understand, and I wish you well, Jake." The note was practical and straightforward, but Rebecca could read between the lines to the care and respect that had motivated it. He was giving her agency in their interaction, making it clear that she could accept his help or decline it without offense, while simultaneously demonstrating that his offer came from genuine desire to help rather than any expectation of reciprocation. She stood in her nightgown in the cold mountain air, holding the note and looking up at the dark bulk of Eagle's Peak where Jake had returned to his solitary existence, and felt something shift inside her chest. For months she'd been moving through life like a ghost, accepting sympathy and assistance because people insisted on providing it, but never feeling truly connected to the kindness she received. This was different. Jake's midnight gift came with no strings attached, no expectation that she would be grateful in any particular way, no requirement that she explain her circumstances or justify her choices. It was simply an offering from one person to another, given freely and without condition. By the time she returned to bed, Rebecca had made her decision. Tomorrow evening, she would light a lantern and place it in the front window, and she would trust that Jake Sullivan was exactly the man his actions suggested him to be. The next day dawned clear and cold with the kind of crystalline air that made everything seem sharper and more vivid than usual. Rebecca woke earlier than she had in months, energized by a sense of purpose that felt almost foreign after so many weeks of drifting through each day without clear direction. She spent the morning learning to use her grandmother's wood stove, following Jake's instructions to bring seasoned wood inside and experimenting with the dampers and airflow controls that determined how hot and how long the fire would burn. It was more complicated than she'd expected, requiring attention and adjustment rather than the simple flip-a-switch convenience she was accustomed to, but there was something deeply satisfying about the process. The heat the stove produced was different from anything she'd experienced, a radiating warmth that seemed to penetrate not just the air but the walls and floors of the cabin, creating a coziness that electric heat had never achieved. The crackling of the burning wood and the occasional pop of sap provided a soundtrack that was both comforting and alive, making the cabin feel inhabited in a way it hadn't since her arrival. While the fire settled into a steady burn, Rebecca tackled the task of cleaning out the root cellar completely, hauling decades of accumulated debris up the narrow stone steps and sorting it into piles of salvageable items and genuine trash. The work was physical and demanding, but it felt good to use her body for something productive, to see tangible results from her efforts. Among the debris she discovered treasures that spoke to her family's history in this place. Mason jars that could be cleaned and used for food storage, hand tools that were old but serviceable, and a collection of handwritten recipes in her grandmother's careful script that brought tears to her eyes. The recipes were for mountain cooking, how to preserve meat without refrigeration, which wild plants could be safely foraged, and how to prepare them. Techniques for making the most of limited ingredients during harsh winters. They represented knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who'd made their lives in these mountains. Practical wisdom that Rebecca suddenly realized she desperately needed. By afternoon she'd made significant progress on the root cellar, and the physical activity had left her feeling more energetic and optimistic than she had in months. The combination of the warm cabin, the productive work, and the knowledge that help was available if she chose to accept it created a sense of possibility that she'd thought was lost forever. She was carrying the last load of debris to the burn pile when she heard the sound of another vehicle coming up the mountain road. This time it was a newer pickup truck, gleaming white with official-looking logos on the doors, and Rebecca felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety as she recognized the kind of vehicle that usually brought bad news. The truck pulled into her driveway with the aggressive confidence of someone who expected to be taken seriously, and the man who climbed out of the driver's seat looked every inch the part of someone accustomed to getting his way. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of careful grooming and expensive clothes that marked him as successful in whatever business he pursued. His shoes were completely inappropriate for mountain terrain, polished leather that would provide no traction on the rocky ground around the cabin. Behind him emerged a younger man carrying a briefcase and a tablet computer, obviously some kind of assistant or associate. They both looked around the property with the assessing gaze of people who saw dollar signs rather than natural beauty, and Rebecca felt her protective instincts rise like hackles on a threatened animal. "Miss Mitchell," the older man called, approaching with the kind of forced friendliness that she'd learned to distrust in her years of dealing with insurance companies and funeral directors. "I'm Victor Caldwell, and this is my associate Brian Peters. We represent Caldwell Development Corporation, and we'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Rebecca set down her load of debris carefully, using the time to study these unexpected visitors and consider how to handle what was obviously going to be an unwelcome conversation. Everything about Victor Caldwell's manner suggested he was accustomed to intimidating people into compliance, and she suspected his business proposition would be anything but beneficial to her interests. "I'm not interested in selling," she said flatly, deciding to cut straight to what she assumed was the heart of his visit. Caldwell's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now don't be so hasty, Miss Mitchell. You haven't even heard what we're prepared to offer. I think you'll find our proposal quite generous, especially considering the current condition of the property." His gaze swept dismissively over the cabin and its obvious need for repair, and Rebecca felt anger begin to simmer in her chest. The casual way he diminished her grandmother's home, the assumption that she would be eager to sell to the first person who offered money, the entire attitude that treated her like a problem to be solved rather than a person making her own choices. All of it reminded her of every condescending interaction she'd endured since David's death. "I said I'm not interested," she repeated, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised even her. "This property has been in my family for 3 generations, and it's not for sale at any price." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Caldwell replied, his tone taking on an edge that suggested he was less accustomed to being refused than he was comfortable with. "The question is whether you're going to be reasonable about this, or whether we need to explore other options." The thinly veiled threat in his words sent a chill down Rebecca's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd heard enough stories about developers who used various forms of pressure to acquire properties they wanted, and she suddenly understood that Victor Caldwell might represent a danger that went far beyond simple, unwanted solicitation. "What other options?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear that was beginning to pool in her stomach. Brian Peters stepped forward, consulting his tablet with the efficient manner of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant information. "Well, there are questions about the property's compliance with current building codes and environmental regulations. The county has been quite interested in ensuring that all structures in this area meet modern safety standards, especially those that might pose fire hazards or other risks to neighboring properties." The implication was clear: if Rebecca didn't sell voluntarily, Caldwell Development would find ways to force her off the property through bureaucratic pressure and legal challenges. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated bullying that worked against people who couldn't afford extended legal battles or expensive property improvements. "This cabin was grandfathered under all relevant codes when my grandmother inherited it," Rebecca said, though she wasn't entirely certain of the legal details involved. "And as far as I know, it's not posing any risks to anyone." "Grandfathering provisions can be quite complicated," Caldwell replied smoothly. especially when properties change hands or when new owners begin making modifications. Sometimes it's discovered that previous exemptions were improperly granted, or that circumstances have changed in ways that affect a property's legal status. Rebecca felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she began to understand the scope of what she might be facing. These men had obviously done their research and come prepared with strategies for pressuring her into submission. They probably had lawyers and connections with local officials, resources she couldn't hope to match with her limited finances and complete lack of experience with property law. "You're trying to intimidate me," she said, the words coming out more accusatory than she'd intended. "Not at all," Caldwell replied, his tone suggesting wounded innocence. "We're simply trying to help you understand the realities of owning property in an area that's experiencing significant development pressure. Sometimes the wise thing is to accept a generous offer while it's still available, rather than risk getting caught up in expensive legal processes that might not work out in your favor." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on gravel, and Rebecca looked up to see Jake Sullivan emerging from the tree line with the same quiet composure she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. He moved toward them with unhurried confidence, his presence somehow changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation without him saying a word. Caldwell and Peters both turned to look at the newcomer, and Rebecca could see them trying to assess whether Jake represented a threat to their plans or simply an inconvenient witness to their pressure tactics. Jake's appearance, the worn work clothes, the practical boots, the aura of someone completely comfortable in this environment obviously marked him as a local rather than someone they needed to worry about impressing. "Afternoon, Rebecca," Jake said, nodding to her with casual familiarity. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Rebecca replied, feeling her confidence return at the sight of him. "Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Peters were just leaving." "Actually, we haven't finished our discussion," Caldwell said, his tone sharpening with obvious irritation at this unexpected development. "This is a private business matter that doesn't concern anyone else." Jake stopped a few feet away from the group, his hands resting loosely at his sides in a posture that looked relaxed, but somehow conveyed the impression that he could move very quickly if necessary. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Funny thing about these mountains," he said conversationally. "Sound carries real well, especially when folks are discussing legal threats and intimidation tactics. Voices tend to echo in ways that make conversations a lot less private than people might expect." The implication was clear. Jake had been listening to enough of their exchange to understand exactly what kind of pressure Caldwell was trying to apply, and he was making it known that Rebecca wasn't as isolated and vulnerable as her visitors might have assumed. Caldwell's face flushed red with anger at having his tactics called out so directly. "I don't know who you think you are, but this conversation doesn't involve you. I suggest you move along before this becomes a legal matter." "Oh, I know exactly who I am," Jake replied mildly. "I'm Jake Sullivan, and I live up on Eagles Peak. Been keeping an eye on this property since Rose Mitchell passed, making sure nothing unfortunate happens to it. Funny thing is, I've got excellent sight lines from my place, and I tend to notice when unfamiliar vehicles show up here. Sometimes I even feel compelled to come down and check on things, especially when those vehicles belong to people who don't seem to have the property owner's best interests at heart." The casual way Jake established both his connection to the property and his ability to monitor what happened here sent a clear message that Rebecca wasn't as alone and unprotected as Caldwell had assumed. The developer's expression shifted as he began to reassess the situation, obviously recognizing that his intimidation tactics would be less effective with a witness present. "This is a legitimate business discussion," Peters said, his tone defensive. "We're simply making an offer to purchase property that the owner is obviously struggling to maintain." "Struggling or not, she said she wasn't interested in selling," Jake observed. "Where I come from, that usually ends the conversation. Unless, of course, someone's planning to use pressure tactics that might not look so good if they became public knowledge." Caldwell's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury, but he was obviously experienced enough to recognize when a situation had shifted against him. After a moment of tense silence,
He pulled a business card from his jacket and extended it toward Rebecca with exaggerated courtesy. Miss Mitchell, I hope you'll reconsider our offer. My contact information is on the card, and the proposal will remain open for a limited time. I'd hate to see you make a decision you might regret later. Rebecca accepted the card without looking at it. Her attention focused on the developer's face as she tried to read his intentions. And if I don't reconsider, then I suppose we'll all have to hope that everything works out for the best. Caldwell replied, his tone carrying undertones that made the words sound more like a threat than a wish. He and Peters returned to their truck without further conversation, but the looks they exchanged as they prepared to leave suggested that this encounter was far from over. As they drove away, Rebecca felt her legs go weak with reaction to the confrontation, and she realized she was shaking with a combination of anger and fear. "You okay?" Jake asked gently, moving closer but stopping at a respectful distance that gave her space to process what had just happened. "I don't think so," Rebecca admitted, her voice unsteady. "I've never had anyone threaten me like that before." The way he talked about legal challenges and code violations, he made it sound like he could force me off this property whether I want to sell or not. Jake was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered what they'd both witnessed. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of practical assessment that she was beginning to appreciate about his approach to problems. "Victor Caldwell's got a reputation for getting what he wants, and he doesn't much care about the methods he uses. He's been buying up properties throughout this valley for the past 2 years, usually by making offers people can't refuse. When they do refuse, he finds ways to make their lives difficult until they change their minds. Can he do what he threatened? Force me off the property through legal challenges? He can try, but it's not as easy as he made it sound. Your grandmother's title is clean, and the cabin's been in continuous use for decades. That gives you protections that aren't simple to override." Jake paused, studying her face with concern. "But legal battles cost money and time, and they can make life pretty miserable even if you eventually win." Rebecca felt the weight of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd come to these mountains seeking peace and healing, only to find herself facing threats that were more complex and dangerous than anything she'd left behind in Richmond. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, the question coming out more like a plea than she'd intended. "You're supposed to decide what this place is worth to you," Jake replied simply. "And then you're supposed to fight for it if it's worth fighting for. But you don't have to fight alone. That's what communities are for." The simple declaration brought tears to Rebecca's eyes, overwhelmed as she was by the day's emotional roller coaster and the growing realization that she'd found herself in the middle of something much larger than a simple property dispute. "The lantern," she said suddenly, remembering his note and the decision she'd made in the early morning hours. "I was going to put a lantern in the window tonight, to let you know I wanted your help with the cabin repairs." Jake nodded, his expression serious but not surprised. "And now?" Rebecca looked around at the property that had suddenly become both sanctuary and battleground, thinking about her grandmother's legacy and her own need for a place to heal and rebuild. The choice felt bigger now, weighted with implications that went far beyond simple home maintenance. "Now I think I need more than help with repairs," she said quietly. "I think I need to learn how to fight for something I love. And I think I'm going to need all the help I can get." Jake's smile was small but genuine, carrying a warmth that made her feel less alone despite the challenges that lay ahead. "Then we'd better get started. Winter's coming, and Victor Caldwell's not the patient type. We've got a lot of work to do if we're going to get you ready for both." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca felt something settle into place inside her chest. For the first time since David's death, she had something worth fighting for that belonged entirely to her future rather than her past. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but it was hers. The lantern glowed like a beacon in the front window that night, its warm light spilling across the porch and into the darkness beyond. Rebecca sat in her grandmother's rocking chair, wrapped in the quilt that still smelled faintly of lavender and mountain air, waiting for Jake to see her signal, and knowing that lighting it had committed her to a path she couldn't fully envision. She didn't have to wait long. Just after 8 o'clock, she heard his familiar
footsteps on the gravel path. and Jake emerged from the shadows carrying a canvas bag and wearing the same calm expression that had become her anchor in an increasingly uncertain world. "Evening," he said, settling onto the porch steps with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in the darkness. "I see you made your decision." "I did," Rebecca replied, though her voice carried more conviction than she actually felt. "Though I have to admit, after today's visit from Mr. Caldwell, this feels like more than just accepting help with home repairs." Jake nodded slowly, his gray eyes reflecting the lantern light as he studied her face. "Victor Caldwell doesn't give up easily, and he's got resources most folks can't match. Fighting him is going to require more than just determination." "What kind of more?" "Community," Jake said simply. "Legal help, political connections, people willing to stand up and make noise when he tries his usual intimidation tactics. The good news is that most of the folks in Cedar Falls have been watching his land grabs with growing concern. You won't be fighting alone." Rebecca felt some of the tension leave her shoulders at his words. The isolation that had seemed like a blessing when she'd fled to these mountains suddenly felt like a vulnerability in the face of Caldwell's threats. But Jake was offering her something she hadn't expected to find: allies in a battle she'd never wanted to fight. "Where do we start?" she asked. Jake reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a thermos and 2 metal cups, the practical gesture somehow managing to transform their serious conversation into something that felt more like a planning session between friends than a war council. "We start with the cabin," he said, pouring coffee that smelled like it had been brewed over an open fire. "Caldwell's threats about building codes and safety violations aren't entirely empty. If he's going to come after you legally, he'll look for any legitimate issues he can exploit. Our job is to make sure there aren't any." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm metal and inhaling the rich aroma. "How long do you think we have before he makes his next move?" "Not long. Men like Caldwell don't like being embarrassed, and having his intimidation tactics called out in front of witnesses definitely embarrassed him. He'll want to reassert control quickly, probably through official channels that make him look legitimate rather than predatory." The assessment sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of official channels?" "Building inspectors, environmental assessments, zoning challenges. He's got enough political connections to make life difficult through bureaucratic pressure. The key is being prepared for whatever he throws at you." Jake paused, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "How much money do you have available for improvements and legal fees?" Rebecca had been dreading this question, knowing that her financial situation was both her greatest vulnerability and her most closely guarded secret. The life insurance money felt like blood money, but she was beginning to understand that David wouldn't want her to lose everything rather than use resources that could protect her future. "Enough," she said carefully. "More than I want to spend, but enough to do what needs doing if it means keeping this place." Jake's perceptive eyes didn't miss the pain in her voice, but he simply nodded without pressing for details. "Then we work smart instead of expensive. Most of what needs doing requires labor more than materials, and there are folks in town who'd be willing to help for cost of supplies plus meals and good company." "You really think people would do that? Help someone they barely know just because she's Rose Mitchell's granddaughter?" "I think people would help someone who's trying to preserve what's good about this valley instead of letting it be turned into another development project." Jake replied, "Your fight with Caldwell isn't just about your property anymore. It's about whether this community gets to keep its character or whether it gets sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder." The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but it also gave Rebecca a sense of purpose that went beyond her own healing. She was no longer just a broken woman trying to find a place to hide from her grief. She was someone fighting for something larger than herself. "What's the first priority?" she asked. Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket, and Rebecca recognized it as a detailed list written in his careful handwriting. "Roof repairs come first. We've got maybe 2 weeks before the weather turns serious, and a leaking roof will give Caldwell's inspectors all the ammunition they need. After that, the chimney rebuild, electrical updates and foundation work." "That sounds like months of work." "It is if we try to do everything to modern standards. But we're not trying to build a showcase. We're trying to create a safe legal dwelling that can't be challenged on legitimate grounds. There's a difference." Jake looked up from his list, his expression serious but encouraging. "The question is whether you're ready to learn some new skills and get your hands dirty." Rebecca thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. Someone who'd called contractors to change light bulbs and had never used any tool more complex than a screwdriver. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life who'd had the luxury of helplessness. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The next 3 weeks transformed Rebecca's understanding of what she was capable of accomplishing. Jake appeared each morning at sunrise, bringing coffee and a work plan that seemed designed to challenge her without overwhelming her. He was a patient teacher, explaining not just how to do things but why they were done in particular ways, building her confidence along with her competence. They started with the roof, Jake demonstrating how to safely navigate the steep angles while Rebecca learned to identify damaged shingles and understand the underlying structure that kept water from penetrating the cabin's interior. The work was physically demanding and occasionally terrifying, but there was deep satisfaction in seeing immediate tangible results from their efforts. Word of their project spread through Cedar Falls with the efficiency of small-town communication networks, and soon Rebecca found herself receiving unexpected visitors who arrived with tools, materials, and expertise she desperately needed. Margaret Thompson brought a crew from the diner's regular customers who spent a Saturday rebuilding the collapsed section of chimney with stones salvaged from other mountain properties. Eleanor Hartwell organized the local quilting circle into a weatherproofing brigade that caulked windows, sealed gaps, and installed storm doors with the precision of a military operation. Even Sheriff Tom Bradley stopped by to inspect their work and offer advice about security measures that might deter vandalism or other forms of harassment. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Rebecca learned to mix mortar, install electrical outlets, and troubleshoot the ancient generator that Jake coaxed back to reliable operation. Her hands grew call-used, her muscles strengthened, and her confidence expanded to match her growing abilities. But the most significant changes weren't physical. Working alongside Jake day after day, Rebecca began to understand the man behind the mountain hermit reputation. He was funny in unexpected moments, sharing dry observations about their work that made her laugh despite her exhaustion. He was incredibly knowledgeable about practical skills, but he also revealed depth in areas she hadn't expected. Literature, history, philosophy discussed during breaks in their labor. Most importantly, he never tried to fix her grief or rush her healing. Instead, he created space for her to be exactly who she was in each moment. Whether that was competent and confident or overwhelmed and missing David so intensely it felt like physical pain. His presence became a constant that she could rely on without feeling like she owed him anything beyond honest partnership in their shared work. The first serious test of their preparations came on a Thursday morning in early November, when Rebecca woke to find two official-looking vehicles parked in her driveway. The county building inspector had arrived with an environmental assessment specialist, both carrying clipboards and wearing expressions that suggested they expected to find significant problems. Rebecca felt her heart rate spike with anxiety, but Jake's steady presence beside her, he'd taken to sleeping in the barn on nights when weather threatened, claiming he wanted to monitor the new roof for leaks, reminded her that they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. "Ma'am, I'm Inspector Williams from the County Building Department," the older man announced. "We've received reports about potential code violations on this property, and we're here to conduct a thorough inspection." "Of course," Rebecca replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'd appreciate the opportunity to accompany you during the inspection, and I'd like my contractor present as well." Jake stepped forward with the quiet authority that marked all his interactions, extending his hand to the inspector. "Jake Sullivan. I've been overseeing the restoration work here, and I have all the permits and documentation you'll need to review." Rebecca watched the inspector's demeanor shift slightly, as Jake produced a folder containing permits she hadn't even known he'd obtained. Work receipts that documented every improvement they'd made, and photographs showing the cabin's condition before and after their efforts. The preparation was so thorough and professional that Williams had to adjust his approach from hostile investigation to routine verification. The inspection took most of the day, but Jake's meticulous documentation and the quality of their work spoke for itself. The roof repairs exceeded current standards, the electrical updates had been performed by a licensed electrician from town, and the chimney rebuild incorporated modern safety features while maintaining the structure's historical character.
When the environmental specialist found no violations and Williams grudgingly admitted that all work had been performed to code, Rebecca felt a surge of triumph that went far beyond simple relief. They had met Caldwell's challenge and emerged stronger for the experience. But Victor Caldwell wasn't finished. The legal pressure began the following week, with letters from lawyers questioning property boundaries, demanding environmental impact studies, and threatening litigation over alleged easement violations. Each challenge required responses that cost money and time, slowly wearing down Rebecca's resources and resolve. It was Maggie Thompson who suggested the solution that changed everything. "You need to make this bigger than just your property," she said during one of their evening planning sessions at the diner. "Caldwell's been targeting isolated landowners who can't fight back effectively. But if this becomes about the whole community's future, suddenly you've got political support that money can't buy." The idea led to the formation of the Millbrook Valley Preservation Society, with Rebecca as its reluctant president and Jake as its most effective organizer. Within weeks, they documented Caldwell's pattern of pressure tactics against other property owners, gathered evidence of his connections to local officials, and built a coalition that included everyone from environmental groups to historical societies. The battle culminated in a packed county commission meeting where Rebecca found herself standing at a podium, addressing a room full of people whose lives would be affected by the commission's decision on Caldwell's latest development proposal. "3 months ago, I came to these mountains as a broken woman running from grief I couldn't face," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded chamber. "I thought I was too damaged for anyone to want to help, too lost to contribute anything meaningful to a community I barely knew." She paused, looking out at faces that had become familiar through weeks of shared work and common purpose. Jake sat in the front row, his steady presence giving her strength to continue. "But this community proved me wrong. They showed me that being broken doesn't make you worthless. It makes you understand what needs healing. They taught me that fighting for something you love isn't about being perfect, it's about being willing to do whatever it takes to protect what matters." Rebecca went on to detail Caldwell's intimidation tactics, his disregard for environmental protection, and his pattern of destroying rural communities in pursuit of profit. But more importantly, she spoke about what preservation meant, maintaining places where healing could happen, where communities could thrive, where the mountains could continue to offer sanctuary to anyone who needed it. When the commission voted unanimously to reject Caldwell's proposal and launch an investigation into his business practices, Rebecca felt a transformation complete itself. She was no longer the desperate widow who'd fled to the mountains seeking refuge. She was a woman who'd found her strength through community, her purpose through service, and her future through unexpected love. The celebration at Thompson's Diner that night felt like a victory party for more than just a zoning decision. It marked the moment when Rebecca fully claimed her place in this mountain community, surrounded by people who'd supported her not despite her brokenness, but because they understood that healing was a community effort. Jake found her on the diner's back porch as the party wound down, the two of them stepping into the cool night air that carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. "How does it feel?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing beside her. "Different," Rebecca said, considering the question seriously. "Like I'm finally becoming who I was supposed to be all along, instead of trying to get back to who I used to be." Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains that rose around them like protective walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. "I came to these mountains because I thought I was too broken for anyone to want to be around," he said. "Spent 3 years convinced that isolation was the only honest way to live with what I'd done, and what I'd lost." Rebecca turned to look at him, seeing not the confident mountain man who'd become her anchor, but the damaged veteran who'd chosen exile over the risk of further pain. "What changed?" she asked softly. "You did," Jake replied simply. "You showed me that being broken doesn't have to mean being alone. That two people can help each other heal without pretending the scars don't exist." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Rebecca felt her heart skip as she recognized the invitation in his words, the suggestion that what had grown between them through weeks of shared work and mutual support might be something more than friendship. "Jake," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice feelings that felt both inevitable and impossible. I know, he said gently. I know it's complicated. I know you love David and that loving someone else doesn't diminish that. I know you came here to heal, not to find romance. But I also know that what we've built together, the trust, the partnership, the way we make each other stronger, that's real too. Rebecca thought about David, about the love they'd shared and the future they'd planned. For months she'd felt like moving forward meant betraying his memory, like healing meant forgetting him. But standing here with Jake, surrounded by the community that had embraced them both, she understood that love didn't diminish love. That building a new future didn't require abandoning the past. I love you, she said quietly, the words coming out like a revelation rather than a declaration. I didn't plan to, and I'm not sure I'm ready for everything that means, but I love you. Jake's smile transformed his entire face, bringing light to eyes that had been shadowed for too long. I love you too, and I'm willing to take this as slowly as you need, to build something at whatever pace feels right for both of us. Their first kiss tasted like coffee and wood smoke, like new beginnings built on acknowledged endings. It was gentle and careful, the tentative exploration of two people who'd learned to trust each other completely but were still discovering what that trust might become. 6 months later, on a spring morning when the mountains were painted green with new growth and the cabin wore window boxes full of wild flowers, Rebecca stood on her front porch and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The property that had once seemed like a refuge from the world had become the center of a thriving community effort. The Millbrook Valley Preservation Society had grown into a regional organization, protecting dozens of properties from development pressure and helping families stay on land their ancestors had settled. Jake had moved into the guest room of the cabin, his presence transforming the space from sanctuary to home. They worked together each day on projects that ranged from their own continuing improvements to helping other families prepare for whatever challenges they might face. The legal battles with Caldwell Development had ended with federal investigations that sent Victor Caldwell to prison for fraud and corruption. His company's assets had been liquidated, with much of the land he'd acquired being transferred to conservation trusts that would protect it permanently. But the most significant change was in Rebecca herself. The broken woman who'd fled to the mountains seeking escape had become someone who helped others find their own paths to healing. The cabin had become an unofficial refuge for people dealing with loss, trauma, and transition. A place where the combination of hard work, natural beauty, and genuine community support created conditions for transformation. Teaching had found her again too, but in a different form. She'd started offering workshops on traditional mountain skills, everything from food preservation to weather preparation to the kind of practical self-sufficiency that Jake had taught her. The classes attracted people from all over the region, drawn by the promise of learning skills their grandparents had taken for granted. On this particular morning, she was expecting a group of women from the city, all dealing with various forms of life upheaval, who'd signed up for a weekend intensive on finding strength in the mountains. Jake was leading a parallel workshop for their partners, focusing on practical skills and outdoor confidence building. As she watched the first cars navigate the winding mountain road that had once seemed so isolating, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief that had driven her here still lived inside her, but it had been transformed from something that diminished her into something that deepened her capacity for compassion. David's memory had found its proper place in her heart, not as a source of guilt that prevented her from moving forward, but as a foundation of love that made new love possible. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck now, close to her heart but no longer marking her as unavailable for whatever the future might hold. Jake appeared beside her as the workshop participants began gathering their gear from their vehicles. His presence still capable of making her heart skip despite the familiarity of their daily partnership. "Ready for another group of broken people looking for healing?" he asked, his tone carrying the gentle humor that had become one of her favorite things about him. "They're not broken," Rebecca replied, watching the women emerge from their cars with the mixture of hope and uncertainty she remembered so well from her own arrival. "They're just ready to discover what they're really capable of." Jake's smile was warm with understanding and pride. And who better to teach them than someone who's learned the difference between being broken and being ready to rebuild? As the workshop participants approached the cabin, Rebecca felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she'd found her purpose. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her future. She was exactly where she belonged, helping others discover that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken ground. The mountains rose around them like eternal guardians, offering their ancient promise that healing was possible, that community could triumph over isolation, and that love in all its forms was the strongest force in any landscape, no matter how rugged or challenging it might appear. In the end, Victor Caldwell had been wrong about everything. Rebecca Mitchell wasn't a broken woman nobody wanted. She was a woman who'd learned to transform brokenness into strength, isolation into community, and despair into hope. And in these mountains that had welcomed her when she had nowhere else to go, she discovered that the most profound healing happens not when we hide from our pain, but when we use it to help others find their own way home. The morning mist clung to Eagle's Peak, like a gentle benediction as Rebecca stood at the edge of the meadow where wildflowers painted the ground in brilliant splashes of purple and gold. 1 year had passed since she'd first lit that lantern in her grandmother's window, signaling her willingness to trust in the kindness of strangers and the possibility that broken hearts could learn to beat with new purpose. Today marked more than just an anniversary. It was the day she and Jake had chosen to pledge their future to each other, surrounded by the community that had embraced them both and in the place where they discovered that love could grow from the most unlikely soil. The ceremony would be simple, reflecting their shared preference for substance over spectacle. Sheriff Tom Bradley had obtained his efficient credentials specifically for this occasion, joking that it was the least he could do for the woman who'd saved the valley from becoming another strip mall paradise. Margaret Thompson had spent weeks preparing a feast that would feed everyone in Cedar Falls twice over, her way of expressing joy that two lonely souls had found their way to each other. But as Rebecca adjusted the wildflower crown that Eleanor Hartwell had woven from blossoms gathered throughout the mountain meadows, she found herself thinking not about the celebration ahead, but about the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect clarity about her future. The woman who'd fled to these mountains 18 months ago had been so consumed by grief that she'd forgotten how to hope for anything beyond simple survival. She'd measured each day by how many hours she could manage without breaking down, how many tasks she could complete before the weight of David's absence became too heavy to bear. Now she measured her days by the satisfaction of work that mattered, by the depth of connections with people who'd become family, by the quiet joy of waking each morning beside a man who understood that loving someone new didn't require forgetting someone lost. The transformation felt miraculous, not because it had happened quickly, but because it had happened at all. A gentle touch on her shoulder brought her back to the present moment, and she turned to find Eleanor smiling at her with the warm approval of someone who'd watched a difficult journey reach its proper destination. "You look radiant, dear," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a woman who'd helped orchestrate countless community celebrations but had never been more pleased with the results. "Jake's a lucky man, though I suspect he knows it." "I'm the lucky one," Rebecca replied, meaning it completely. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought love was something that happened once and never again. Jake taught me that hearts don't have finite capacity. They just grow larger to accommodate whatever we're brave enough to let inside. Eleanor's eyes misted with tears that spoke to decades of her own experience with love found, lost, and discovered again. "Your grandmother would be so proud. Rose always believed this mountain was meant for healing, but even she might be surprised by how complete your healing has been." Through the trees, Rebecca could hear the sounds of the gathering crowd as friends and neighbors arrived for the ceremony. Voices called greetings, children laughed as they chased each other through the meadow grass, and someone tuned a guitar in preparation for the music that would accompany their vows. The guest list included people whose lives had been touched by the preservation work that had grown from Rebecca's initial fight to save her cabin. Families who'd been able to keep ancestral land, thanks to legal strategies developed through the Valley Preservation Society. Young people who'd learned traditional skills through the workshops Rebecca now taught regularly. Even former opponents like county commissioners, who'd initially supported Caldwell's development plans but had been swayed by the community organizing that followed. Jake appeared at the edge of the meadow, and Rebecca felt her breath catch as she saw him in the formal clothes he'd chosen for their wedding. He wore a charcoal gray suit that emphasized his tall frame and the silver threading through his dark hair, but he'd paired it with boots that could handle mountain terrain and a wildflower boutonniere that matched her crown. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd found the perfect balance between civilization and wilderness, formality and authenticity. Their eyes met across the distance, and the smile that passed between them carried the weight of everything they'd built together. Partnership in work, trust through challenges, love that had grown slowly and surely from shared purpose into something unshakable. "Ready?" Eleanor asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. Anyone who looked at Rebecca could see that she'd never been more ready for anything in her life. The ceremony began with Sheriff Bradley's opening words about community, commitment, and the special privilege of witnessing two people choose to build a future together. But what Rebecca would remember most was not the formal language of vows and rings, but the moment when Jake took her hands and spoke from his heart about what their partnership had meant to him. "When I came to these mountains I thought I was finished with hope," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow but somehow feeling intimate despite the crowd of witnesses. "I'd convinced myself that some kinds of damage couldn't be repaired, that some losses were too great to recover from. You taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means learning to carry our experiences in ways that make us stronger instead of smaller." Rebecca felt tears slip down her cheeks as she listened to words that perfectly captured her own transformation. When her turn came to speak, she found herself looking not just at Jake, but at the faces of people who'd become her chosen family through shared work and common cause. "I used to think that love was something that happened to you, something you received as a gift and treasured carefully because it might not come again,"
she said. But love isn't something you hoard, it's something you cultivate. It grows when you tend it with daily kindness, when you water it with trust, when you give it room to become something larger than what either person could create alone. The exchange of rings was accompanied by promises that went beyond traditional vows to include commitments about their shared work, their responsibility to the community that had supported them, and their intention to continue offering refuge to others who needed space to heal and grow. When Sheriff Bradley pronounced them married and invited Jake to kiss his bride, the celebration that erupted from their friends and neighbors felt like the entire valley expressing its approval of this union. Children threw wildflower petals. Margaret Thompson wiped away tears as she served cake that had taken her 3 days to perfect, and someone started playing guitar music that turned the meadow into an impromptu dance floor. But the moment Rebecca treasured most came later, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks and the celebration settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who planned to talk and laugh together until the stars appeared. She and Jake had stolen away to the edge of the meadow, wanting a few minutes of quiet together before returning to their guests. "No regrets?" Jake asked, his arm around her waist as they watched their friends and neighbors enjoy the party they'd created. "Only that it took me so long to understand that being broken doesn't make you unworthy of love," Rebecca replied. "That fighting for something you believe in can heal wounds you didn't even know you carried." Jake's kiss was gentle but certain, the kiss of a man who'd found his home not just in a place but in a person. "Think we're ready for whatever comes next?" Rebecca considered the question seriously, thinking about the challenges they'd already faced together and the dreams they'd begun planning for their shared future. The preservation work that was expanding beyond their valley, the workshops that were drawing people from across the region, the possibility of children who would grow up understanding that communities could triumph over corporate greed, that mountains offered healing to anyone brave enough to accept it. "I think we're ready for anything," she said finally. "As long as we face it together." The party continued until well past midnight, with guests camping in the meadow and around the cabin, turning the celebration into the kind of community gathering that would be remembered and retold for years to come. But eventually, the last guitar was put away, the final toast was shared, and Rebecca and Jake found themselves alone in the cabin that had become the foundation of everything they'd built together. The space had been transformed by their partnership. What had once been a refuge for one grieving woman had become a home that reflected two lives woven together with intention and care. Jake's tools hung beside Rebecca's teaching materials. His photographs of mountain landscapes shared wall space with her framed letters from workshop participants whose lives had been changed by their time in the valley. Most importantly, the cabin had become a place of active hope rather than passive retreat. The guest room was rarely empty, hosting a steady stream of people who needed time and space to process their own losses and transitions. The kitchen was frequently full of community meetings, planning sessions, and informal gatherings that had become central to the valley's social fabric. As they prepared for bed on their wedding night, Rebecca found herself thinking about the letter she'd written to David earlier that day. It had become her practice to write to him on significant occasions, sharing news about her life and expressing gratitude for the foundation of love he'd given her that made new love possible. "I'm marrying Jake today," she'd written in her careful script, "not because I've forgotten you, or because what we had wasn't enough, but because you taught me how to love completely and honestly. Jake understands that he's not replacing you. He's adding to the story you started. I think you'd like him. He has the same kind of integrity you did, the same commitment to doing what's right even when it's difficult. He makes me laugh the way you did, and he believes in my strength even when I doubt it myself." The letter was tucked away in the wooden box where she kept all her correspondence with David's memory, a practice that had evolved from desperate clinging to healthy remembrance. Jake not only supported this ritual but had occasionally added his own notes to David, expressing gratitude for the man whose love had shaped the woman Jake had fallen in love with. Their first night as a married couple was spent not in passionate romance but in quiet conversation about their dreams for the future. They talked about the children they might raise in these mountains, about the work they wanted to accomplish together, about the kind of legacy they hoped to leave for the community that had embraced them both. When they finally fell asleep, it was with the deep contentment of people who'd found their proper place in the world and the perfect partner with whom to share it. The years that followed validated every hope they dared to voice during those first tentative planning sessions on the cabin's front porch. The Millbrook Valley Preservation Society grew into a model organization studied by conservationists across the country. Their workshops expanded to include not just practical skills but healing programs that helped people process trauma while learning self-sufficiency. Rebecca discovered that her calling wasn't just teaching mountain skills but helping people understand that resilience was something that could be cultivated through community support and purposeful work. She developed curricula that were adopted by grief counseling programs, wilderness therapy organizations, and veteran support groups throughout the region. Jake's military background proved invaluable as their programs began serving former combat veterans who struggled with civilian reintegration. His ability to communicate without judgment, to offer practical challenges that rebuilt confidence, and to create safe spaces for people to process difficult experiences made him a sought-after consultant for similar programs nationwide. Their own family grew to include 3 children who were raised with an understanding that the mountains were not just their playground but their responsibility. Emma, Thomas, and Rose, named for the grandmother whose cabin had started it all, learned early that their parents' work was about more than personal healing. It was about creating communities where healing was possible for anyone who needed it. The children grew up bilingual in both English and the mountain wisdom that had sustained their family for generations. They could read weather patterns, identify edible plants, and troubleshoot mechanical problems with the same ease that their city cousins navigated video games and social media. But they also understood that their privileges came with obligations to help others access the same opportunities for growth and healing. On Rebecca's 50th birthday, the community organized a celebration that drew hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the work that had grown from her initial desperate flight to the mountains. Former workshop participants shared stories of how the skills they'd learned had helped them through subsequent challenges. Families spoke about land that remained in their ownership because of legal strategies developed through the Preservation Society. Most moving were the testimonials from people who'd found their way to the mountain community during their own dark nights of the soul and discovered that broken didn't mean worthless, that healing was possible, and that community could triumph over the forces that sought to divide and exploit. Standing on the same porch where she'd first seen Jake emerge from the forest, surrounded by friends and family, and the tangible evidence of a life well lived,
Rebecca marveled at the distance she'd traveled from that desperate woman who'd fled Richmond with nothing but grief and a determination to find somewhere to hide. Regrets? Jake asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding day but with the deeper knowledge that came from decades of shared challenges and victories. None, Rebecca replied, and meant it completely. Every heartbreak, every moment of despair, every time I thought I couldn't continue, all of it led to this. To us, to this community, to the knowledge that love multiplies when you share it instead of hoarding it. Their children played in the meadow where their parents had been married, their laughter mixing with the voices of friends who'd gathered to celebrate not just Rebecca's birthday but the community she'd helped create. The Preservation Society's work continued to expand, protecting more land and helping more families while developing new models for sustainable rural development. But perhaps the most significant measure of their success was visible in the faces of the people who'd found healing in these mountains. Former workshop participants who'd gone on to create their own communities of support. Veterans who'd rediscovered purpose through service to others facing similar struggles. Families who'd learned that fighting for what they loved was always worthwhile, even when the odds seemed impossible. As the celebration continued into the night, Rebecca found herself thinking about the message she'd want to leave for future generations who might face their own moments of despair and doubt. The words came to her with the clarity that often accompanies moments of deep satisfaction with choices well made. Nobody wants a broken woman, she'd cried into the mountain air during those first desperate weeks in her grandmother's cabin. But she'd been wrong about that, as she'd been wrong about so many things during that dark period of her life. The truth was simpler and more beautiful than she'd been able to see then. Broken people were exactly what the world needed most. They understood suffering in ways that made them uniquely qualified to help others heal. They'd learned that strength didn't come from avoiding difficulty, but from facing it with support and purpose. They knew that community wasn't just a nice idea but a necessity for human flourishing. Jake had proved her wrong about being unwanted. But more importantly, he'd helped her understand that her brokenness wasn't a flaw to be hidden but a qualification for the work she'd been called to do. The mountains had provided the setting, but the real transformation had come through the daily choice to trust in the possibility of healing and to extend that possibility to others. As the party wound down and their guests began making their way home through the mountain darkness, Rebecca and Jake stood together on the porch that had witnessed so many significant moments in their shared story. The cabin glowed with warm light, welcoming as it had been on that first night when she'd lit a lantern to signal her willingness to accept help. "Think we've justified your grandmother's faith in this place?" Jake asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the valley that had become their life's work. "I think we've proved that mountains don't just provide refuge," Rebecca replied. "They provide the space and the challenge needed for people to discover who they're really meant to become." The mountains rose around them in the darkness, eternal and patient, offering their ancient promise to anyone brave enough to accept it. That healing was possible, that community could triumph over isolation, and that love in all its forms was the strongest force in any landscape. In the distance, lights twinkled from the homes of neighbors who'd become family, people who'd learned that protecting what they loved required fighting for it together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people seeking healing, new opportunities to prove that broken could become beautiful when tended with patience and community support. But tonight, Rebecca Mitchell Sullivan stood in the place where she'd learned to transform despair into hope, surrounded by the evidence that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with a single desperate step toward whatever light can be found in the darkness. The mountains had kept their promise. They'd provided exactly what she'd needed when she'd needed it most: space to heal, work that mattered, and a community that understood that the most beautiful things often grow from the most broken ground. 25 years after Rebecca Mitchell first fled to the Blue Ridge Mountains with nothing but grief and a desperate hope for sanctuary, she stood at the podium of the newly constructed Mountain Heritage Center, preparing to address an audience that included conservation leaders, government officials, and dozens of families whose lives had been transformed by the work that had grown from her grandmother's humble cabin. The center itself was a testament to what could be accomplished when vision met determination. Built from locally sourced timber and stone, powered by renewable energy systems, and designed to showcase traditional mountain crafts alongside modern sustainability practices, it represented everything the preservation movement had achieved over the past quarter century. But the real measure of their success wasn't visible in buildings or acreage protected. It lived in the faces of the people gathered for this dedication ceremony, men and women who'd discovered that healing was possible, children who'd grown up understanding their responsibility to protect the land that sustained them, families who'd learned that fighting for what they loved was always worthwhile. Rebecca's hair was silver now, streaked with white that caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the center's soaring windows. Her hands bore the calluses and small scars that marked decades of practical work, and her face showed the lines that came from years of laughter shared with people she'd grown to love. At 65, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. Jake stood among the crowd, his own hair completely silver but his posture still carrying the alertness that marked his military background. Their children sat in the front row, Emma now a conservation lawyer working to protect wilderness areas across the southeast, Thomas a sustainable agriculture specialist, helping mountain communities develop food security, and Rose pursuing a doctorate in community psychology with a focus on rural mental health initiatives. The audience also included faces that told the larger story of what had begun as one woman's desperate flight from grief. Dr. Sarah Chen, who developed therapeutic wilderness programs based on the model Rebecca had pioneered. Marcus Rodriguez, a veteran who'd found purpose through the mountain skills workshops and now ran similar programs in 3 other states. Margaret Williams, whose family had been able to keep their ancestral farm thanks to legal strategies developed through the Preservation Society. As Rebecca looked out over this gathering of people whose lives intersected through shared commitment to healing and conservation, she felt the profound satisfaction that came from knowing that her own journey through darkness had created light for countless others. When I first came to these mountains, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, I thought I was finished with hope. I believed that some kinds of brokenness couldn't be repaired, that some losses were too devastating to recover from. I was wrong about almost everything except my instinct that these mountains held something I desperately needed. She paused, looking toward the windows that framed Eagle's Peak in the distance, remembering the morning she'd first seen Jake emerge from that forest and set in motion everything that had followed. I learned that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community, through the daily choice to trust that tomorrow might be better than today. Through the willingness to accept help even when accepting it feels like admitting defeat. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing on decades of experience in helping others navigate their own dark passages. But most importantly, I learned that our wounds don't disqualify us from usefulness. They qualify us for the most important work of all. The work of helping others discover that they're stronger than they know, more valuable than they believe, and more capable of transformation than they dare to imagine. The speech continued for 20 minutes, weaving together stories of individual healing with broader themes about community resilience, environmental stewardship, and the power of people working together toward common goals. But what moved the audience most was Rebecca's unflinching honesty about her own journey. Her willingness to speak openly about the depths of despair she'd experienced, and the slow, difficult process of rebuilding a life worth living. When she finished speaking, the applause was sustained and heartfelt, but what Rebecca treasured most was the sight of tears on faces throughout the audience. Tears that spoke to recognition, to hope, to the understanding that transformation was possible for anyone brave enough to pursue it. The reception that followed gave Rebecca the opportunity to reconnect with people whose stories had become woven into the larger narrative of the mountain community. She spoke with former workshop participants who'd gone on to start their own healing centers, with families who'd successfully fought development pressures in their own communities, with young people who'd grown up understanding that conservation was both a privilege and a responsibility. But the conversation that moved her most was with a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, who'd arrived at the mountain community just 6 months earlier carrying her own burden of loss and displacement. Jennifer had lost her husband and young son in a car accident, and had come to the mountains seeking the same kind of refuge Rebecca had found decades earlier. I keep waiting to feel like myself again, Jennifer said quietly as they stood together on the center's observation deck, looking out over the valley that had become home to so many people seeking healing. I keep thinking that if I just try hard enough, I can get back to being the person I was before everything changed. Rebecca heard echoes of her own voice from years past, the desperate desire to return to a version of herself that no longer existed and perhaps never could again. The question brought back memories of her own struggle to understand that healing didn't mean going backward, but learning to move forward carrying love and loss in equal measure. "You can't go back," Rebecca said gently, her words carrying the authority of lived experience. "The person you were before exists only in memory now, and trying to resurrect her will keep you trapped in a past that no longer serves you. But the person you're becoming, she has strengths and insights that your former self never possessed." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears as she struggled with the truth of those words. "But I don't know who that person is yet. I don't know how to be anyone other than a grieving mother and widow." "You don't have to know yet," Rebecca replied, remembering her own confusion during those first months in the mountains, when every day felt like an exercise in learning how to exist without the people who defined her identity. "You just have to be willing to discover her. Day by day, choice by choice, relationship by relationship." They talked until the sun set behind the western peaks, their conversation covering everything from practical strategies for managing overwhelming grief to philosophical questions about the purpose of suffering and the possibility of finding meaning in loss. It was the kind of deep, honest exchange that had become central to Rebecca's work, not just teaching practical skills but creating space for people to process their experiences and find their own paths forward. As the evening wound down and guests began making their way home through the mountain darkness, Rebecca found herself walking the familiar path back to the cabin where her journey had begun. The structure had been lovingly maintained over the years, serving now as a guest house for people participating in longer-term healing programs, but it remained essentially unchanged from the refuge her grandmother had created. Jake joined her on the porch that had witnessed so many significant conversations, bringing 2 cups of coffee and settling into the rocking chair that had been his preferred spot for evening reflection throughout their marriage. "Good day?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer from the satisfaction visible in her expression. "Perfect day," Rebecca replied, meaning it completely. "The kind of day that makes all the difficult days worth enduring." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, owls calling from the forest, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks in the creek, the gentle rustle of wind through pine needles. These were the sounds that had provided the soundtrack to Rebecca's healing, the constant presence that had anchored her during the months when human comfort felt too difficult to accept. "Jennifer reminds me of myself at the beginning," Rebecca said eventually. "So desperate to get back to who she was before that she can't see who she might become." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Takes time to understand that grief changes you permanently, but that doesn't mean it destroys you. Some people never learn the difference." "She'll learn," Rebecca said with the confidence that came from watching hundreds of people navigate similar journeys. "She has the same hunger for something real that brought me here. That hunger is what makes healing possible." Their conversation drifted to other topics: updates from their children, plans for expanding the therapeutic programs, news from other conservation communities that had adopted their model. But underneath the practical discussions was the deeper satisfaction of people who'd found their life's work and pursued it with dedication and love. As the night deepened, Rebecca found herself thinking about the letter she'd written to David on their wedding anniversary each year. A tradition that had evolved from desperate communication with the dead to grateful acknowledgement of the foundation he'd provided for everything that followed. This year's letter had been different from the early ones, which had been filled with apologies for moving forward and desperate assurances that she hadn't forgotten him. After 25 years of healing and growth, her annual correspondence had become celebration rather than justification, gratitude rather than guilt. "I wanted to tell you about the center dedication," she'd written in her careful script. "Jake and I have created something beautiful here, something that honors both the love you taught me and the strength I found after losing you. I think you'd be proud of what grew from the seeds of pain you never meant to plant." The letter had gone on to describe the day's events, the people whose lives had been touched by work that began with her own desperate need for healing, the way love had multiplied instead of diminished when she'd learned to share it freely. It was the kind of communication that would have been impossible during those first years after his death, when pain made everything feel like betrayal. Now she understood that love wasn't finite, that healing someone else didn't mean forgetting him, that building a new life didn't require abandoning the memories that had shaped her. David lived on not just in her heart, but in every person she'd helped find their way through darkness, in every family that had been able to keep their land, in every moment when someone discovered they were stronger than they'd believed possible. Jake reached for her hand as they prepared to go inside, the gesture automatic after decades of partnership but still capable of providing comfort and connection. His touch reminded her of another truth she'd learned through years of helping others heal, that accepting love didn't diminish the love she'd known before, it simply added to the richness of a life lived fully. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding day, but with the deeper knowledge that came from years of facing challenges together. Rebecca considered the question seriously, thinking about the expansion plans for their programs, the young people who would carry their work into the future, the ongoing need for places where healing could happen safely and completely. "Ready for anything," she said, meaning it completely. "As long as we continue doing it together." As they walked inside the cabin that had sheltered so many people seeking refuge from life's storms, Rebecca felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she'd answered the call of her own healing by creating space for others to discover theirs. The mountains had kept their promise, providing exactly what she'd needed when she'd needed it most: community, purpose, and the daily opportunity to transform personal pain into universal healing. The broken woman who'd fled to these mountains in despair had become someone who helped others understand that broken didn't mean worthless, that healing was always possible, and that the most beautiful transformations often began with the bravest step into unknown territory. Tomorrow would bring new people seeking refuge, new opportunities to prove that mountains offered more than just scenic beauty. They provided the space and challenge needed for profound personal transformation. But tonight, Rebecca Mitchell Sullivan rested in the satisfaction of a life well lived, surrounded by the evidence that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single desperate prayer for sanctuary. The mountains rose around them in the darkness, eternal guardians keeping watch over all who sought their ancient promise of healing and renewal. And in the cabin where it all began, two people who'd found their way to each other through loss and hope prepared for sleep, knowing they'd spend tomorrow continuing the work of proving that love multiplies when shared, and that community can triumph over any force that seeks to divide and destroy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.